Thank you so much. I appreciate it a lot. Now, spiritual dimensions of ESD from a philosophy of science perspective. Actually, now, I asked my mother a couple of days ago what she imagined when hearing this topic, and she looked at me a bit like, this is how she looked at me. And, you know, it makes a lot of sense because it really seemed to be a complex, intricate topic, right? So we have spiritual dimensions. So I've heard quite a couple of presentations yet, and nobody actually dared to define the concept. So I don't either. Education for sustainable development might perhaps be a bit easier, but also this, you know, actually comprises a complexity, a variety of activities and approaches. And then, of course, we have a philosophy of science perspective. I don't believe that there's one philosophy of science perspective, right? So there are different perspectives. And there are also different questions that we can ask from a philosophy of science perspective, right? We can, for example, question or be interested in the ontology of spiritual dimensions. So what are spiritual dimensions in ESD? We can ask about the epistemology, like how can we actually know something about spiritual dimensions? We can ask about the ethics, like should we actually approach or include them, and how should we do that? And then finally, there's a methodological question that we can also raise, namely, you know, how can we actually access them in a specific educational context? Now, when also presenting this, preparing this presentation, I was wondering about my own intention. So what was actually my purpose of giving this presentation? And I often feel that, you know, a keynote is something where you present your expertise or, you know, have to excel in something. But actually, I didn't feel like an expert in this topic, but rather a learner. And I also had more questions about the topic than answers. So, although I will speak about all of these facets, my intention is actually quite modest. I, you know, want to share my current perspective on these matters and how they came about, without, you know, saying that this is a completed, or, you know, yeah, let's call it a complete perspective. But it's rather the idea of sharing my perspective to further deepen the conversation and exploration together with you in the next days, but also perhaps beyond. And I will actually do that by looking at a rather recent trend that you can see in sustainability science and sustainability-related education, namely an interest in inner worlds. And so I will actually take you through my personal journey on working on this topic for the last, like, professionally 10 years and like privately a bit longer. And so I've very much involved and contributed to this development on an interest in inner worlds. And I'm still very much in favor of it. I think it is very important because, after all, sustainability is something that, you know, concerns us as human beings internally, right? Not just externally. And at the same time, I also developed some skepticism and concerns recently. And that is namely because I think that I get the impression that it is how inner worlds are approached in this, like in the current way in education and sustainable development, sustainability sciences, based on a quite instrumental and positivist paradigm, in which we know what sustainability is and how to achieve it, and inner development becomes kind of this instrument to get there. And I would actually oppose these assumptions and say that not only do we not know what sustainability is, nor do we know how to get there. But I do think that in order to find answers to these important questions, we, you know, actually need a willingness to really dive deep and explore deeply what it actually means to be alive, to be human, to explore the different levels of human existence, and in particular the dark sides, I would call them, of human existence. And so this approach to kind of radically facing the truth of our existence is actually quite scary. And at the same time, my work is very much is very much directed to this idea of supporting learners or supporting humans in facing this reality, in facing this seek for truth. And therefore, I actually, a key statement of my presentation can be put this way, that in my opinion, what a spiritual path in education for sustainable development could be described in this way. Truth is the compass, not the destination, cultivating inner freedom to navigate through the unknown. Yeah? Yeah, so we don't, the question come in the end, okay? All right. So let's begin the journey. So I start very early. I was born in 1985 in the Eifel region. It's close to Köln, Bonn. Grew up in a let's call it normal German family. No particular political orientation, political activism, sustainability didn't really matter in this context, right? So there was also no spiritual or religious connection or so, right? So I just grew up in this, let's say, normal German life. But nevertheless, from a very early stage on, I developed strong political opinions and also expressed them, though. So this is me. In 2003, and retrospectively, so that was something that I didn't know then. So I was very much politically active. Joined attack movement. Actually went in Gorleben, the nuclear transport protests. I went to prison for a day. In many ways, very much politically active. Also personally, became vegetarian when I was 12. All kinds of stuff that I did. But retrospectively, seeing something that I didn't know then was the reason why I did this was that not because I thought that it was important, but because I felt a strong pain when being confronted with suffering in the world. Or injustice, or especially like with animals, right? I just felt this sympathy toward them, and I was just emotionally touched by it. And this was actually the main driver for me to engage in these kinds of activism. But at a later stage, I also engaged in something that many people would probably consider more spiritual experiences. So I did quite extensive traveling for 4 years, actually. And of course, this also shaped, in many ways, my personality. But what I do say, what I retrospectively would say, that I didn't have any idea of importance of inner worlds, inner dimensions, spirituality, right? So that was not important to me at all. And if you ask me about the relevance, I probably would have neglected it, right? This said, I did develop at a very early stage this idea of, as a human being, we have a responsibility for the outer world and the world we live in, and we also have this efficacy to do something about it. So that was something at a very early stage that I developed, and that was important to me. Now, something that happened then in the 2010s or so, probably one of my, it was actually my second more existential crisis, that also retrospectively, what really happened there was that I got a connection to my embodied experience, to my feelings, to, actually, when I was thinking, there was also something emotionally happening within me. So, and I could recognize it and I can respond to it. So that was an important step in this regard. And I also realized that the things that happened within me embodiedly also had a relevance for sustainability related issues, because that was still something very important to me. And then I also started engaging in it academically. Particularly, I mentioned it before, I was interested in attitude behavior gaps and looked at what you call a meat paradox. So the meat paradox, essentially describing that people say they like animals, perhaps even like animals, at the same time eat them, right? And how could this, how could this actually happen? And what I found out in my research that was a lot, that could very much be explained by looking at inner factors, emotional processes, cognitive dissonances, and so on and so forth. And I found this very important, that it was less the the intellectual approach, but really more of this embodied inner experiences, inner processes that explained this. And yet, in academia, I found that we could talk and write about emotions, but there was no way of working with it. So emotions are were basically absent in research practice, but also educational practice. And then the next important step for me was that I more and more engaged in what you could call like contemplative practices. Started doing Iyengar yoga teachers training, later on engaged in mindful self-compassion training, and teacher training, and so I really engaged in this practice, and this was something that was for me the missing piece, really. Like there was a practice where you could actually, what you could call the experiential qualities, like experiential practice, experiential education. So you would feel what would happen in your body, you could actually work with it, right? You could recognize it. And that was, for me, really the missing piece also in the educational realm. So you had really something to turn inwardly. And I thought, well, this is actually what we need to promote a sustainability transformation, whatever you want to call it. Like make people act more sustainably, because after all, I thought, also in the meat paradox, after all, we are all interested in sustainability and behaving sustainably. These were my ideas. And if you could actually engage people in this kind of practices, they would recognize that. So they would recognize their incongruencies, inconsistencies, and would then automatically change it, right? So, being this advocate of contemplative practices, I very much engaged also academically in this type of work. For example, in conferences early on in 2016, International Conference on Mindfulness, I talked about this possible relationship or possible potential of mindfulness practices to foster, to overcome attitude behavior gaps. Gave a lot of teaching that was mindfulness centered. My dissertation was entirely dedicated to the topic. Also organized my own conference in Lüneburg, which was, to my knowledge, the first where we actually focused on this sustainability and me aspect. And of course, also published, a couple of articles on it. So I was this kind of very, very much convinced of it and advocate of it. Oops. Oh, yeah. But then there was a turning point. By the way, this figure here doesn't make any sense, but I just liked it, so I couldn't delete it. Okay, so I found it very beautiful. But anyway, so I did develop this skepticism about contemplative practices, and I will explain you why this is. So there are basically three reasons. The first, I discovered the dark side of yoga. What I actually mean with the dark side of yoga, it's very, very simply speaking, I got somewhat delusioned by my idea of, okay, so this is the truly experiential pathway that you can follow. Because first of all, and everybody will become better following this pathway, because I soon discovered that people practicing at least Iyengar yoga were no better than people outside of Iyengar yoga. So the way they dealt with themselves and all this, oh no, Guruji said that, and that is the real thing, and that is wrong, and blah, 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 and all this gossiping, in fights, who's right. And then also I remember, I also recognized that the practice itself was, at least at a certain point, not so much experiential unless you believed in the assumptions that the practice was based on. So for me, you know, one example that clearly illustrates this, there was a lot of chanting also, but we also chanted in this teacher training. And, you know, as we did this morning, I think it's a wonderful thing to chant together, right? And it creates this atmosphere of belonging and yeah. But anyway, there was this, you know, my buddy, and he asked, like, yeah, so what is it actually about? And then, well, the answer was, yeah, to develop, you know, this sense of belonging and just creating an atmosphere. And then he said, well, but why do we do it in Sanskrit? So if it's about belonging, then I could also sing Marmor, Stein und Eisen bricht. So that's a German Schlager song. That's what yeah, of course you can do that, right? But the response was, no, because Sanskrit is actually the essence of language, and it creates a different layer of you know, being touched. And perhaps it's the case, I can say, you know, I didn't make this experience, and I don't believe in it. And, you know, these were experiences symbolizing why, at some point, I just couldn't follow this idea anymore, this you know, the promises it made. Second step was, you know, more generally, developing a broader picture on mindfulness, yoga, these kinds of traditions, right? So if you're interested, of course, a wonderful documentary on spiritual leaders, Kumare, very, how can I say, inspiring movie, because he actually pretends to be a spiritual leader, and all the people start following him. So a very interesting documentary. You know, also, you know, Osho, for example, with his 100X limousines, right? Not necessarily epitomizing the modest spiritual practitioner. Of course, a lot of literature also coming out about, like, you know, illustrating this trend of how mindfulness, yoga, etc., actually become commercialized and used by any context, actually, right? So you can practice mindfulness, you know, to become more sustainable, but you can also practice, and is practiced, to become a better sniper in the military, right? And so here you see just, you know, how much the commercial interest behind these practices is. But, you know, let's look into the more, like the actual research on sustainable consumption mindfulness, because we did such a study, it was called the Binker study, in which we developed an 8-week mindfulness-based intervention, had intervention control groups, and many participants, over 100 participants from different social backgrounds, and you know, conducted and looked actually into the effects of this practice on sustainable consumption behavior. And, you know, to be straightforward, the quantitative study didn't find any effects. So practicing mindfulness at least for 8 weeks didn't lead to more sustainable consumption behaviors. The qualitative study, if you see here, did have some effects, but interestingly also adverse effects. So people who engaged in the practice, you know, would, to some extent, even consume less sustainable afterwards. And the reason for that was that they felt, you know, well, I actually become more self-compassionate to myself. I allow myself to consume, you know, more unsustainably, right? But what I actually find interesting is not so much, you know, looking at the effects, but looking at, you know, if you dig deeper into that, what does actually explain the effects? And here, you know, something very interesting happens is, you know, we think about, okay, what is mindfulness practice? So you sit there and then you meditate. Well, that's the first thing. You know, what are you actually doing when meditating? That is not at all a trivial question. People do all kinds of stuff. All kinds of stuff, really, right? And to some extent, it might not have anything to do with what is actually intended. But interestingly is also that, you know, the whole practice is embedded in a context. So there are other people, you have a relation to the teacher, there's a particular time frame where you meet and practice, right? And all these things, that is kind of what you see here, influences the effects and explains the effects even. So, you know, sometimes people would not like explain the effects because they had a conversation with the other practitioner. So it was not at all about the mindfulness practice itself, right? Even the questionnaires and the interviews has effects. So there's a lot of stuff going on that explains the effects. Plus, of course, all kinds of other factors that I just mentioned that influence the course experience and how people process this course experience and so on and so forth. So the conclusion of that is mindfulness is certainly not this pill. And there's no practice that is this panacea, okay, here you take it, because that's not how it works. And it's the same, I would argue it's the same, very much the same for any also spiritual practice, religious practice that we see. It's embedded in a context and it's just not working, such as taking antibiotics. And there are many other factors that play in. And it's not a linear relationship, so doing that leads to that. And so beyond the study, so of course I further explored this, also work as associate editor for the journal Mindfulness, and therefore I have received a lot of papers on this topic and work as reviewers for sustainability science journals, and also review quite a few articles in this context. And something that I presented last year on a keynote at the International Conference on Environmental Mindfulness is, at a larger scale, there's a lot of reason to be skeptical about these practices that, spiritual practices, let's call them at this point, when it comes to this promise of if you do that, then you become more sustainable. And I won't get into all these detailed reasons, but just to make it short, there is a reoccurring pattern in the way these studies or studies that look at these practices actually designed. And they all almost all share the same methodological shortcoming. So the first thing is they have a pre-selected sample. So for example, let's say you conduct a study on human nature relatedness, human nature connectedness, whatever you want to call it, and you work at the university and you run a course. And then you got all the students who are super fascinated by it at the end of the course, but these were students that joined the course because they liked it in the first place, right? So, and then, can we close that? So, what you would actually need to do to get a broader picture is to ask people who haven't participated, why did you not participate? Or sort of, if they participated, how would they actually experience it? Something we did in the Binker study, so it was not based on this, self-selection. Also, what never happens is actually this idea of why do people actually drop out? You have high dropout rates in these practices in many cases, and why is that? So the same goes for a yoga class, right? So you look at these benefits of yoga class, but you don't ask all these people who left the yoga class after the first session, right? And there's also neglect of the counter-intended effects, also a lack of interest in what explains actually the effects what I just mentioned. And something that I also find important is what we consider as sustainable, because also this is very, very much selected. So for example, let's say you conduct a study on mindfulness and yoga, and you look at eating behavior. And then you see that people who practice yoga and meditation, they tend to eat less meat. Well, that's not very surprising, right? Because the whole tradition is one that promotes a vegetarian diet. So that is very much expectable that people who engage in the community will also, follow these practices, and perhaps that is the reason why they engage in these communities in the first place, right? If you looked at, let's say, the relation between mindfulness practitioners and housing, and the surface they use, or the flights they take, I'm pretty sure you will actually get different results, because I would expect that your housing surface raises the more you practice yoga and meditation, because you can afford it, right? So again, there are a lot of other explanations, but this is just not looked at. So what I do think about the current state of the research is the effects that you could have, and the effects that you could see, can very much explained by effect that I would call self-confirmation. So basically, what many of these practices do is, you have a mental model in your head, so you have your values, you find things important, right? You also know what it means, and it can also be like self-compassion. Then you basically observe what is happening, or my body, you know, whatever. But the way you make sense of it is that it confirms the mental models. So that if you're looking for self-compassion, let's say, and you feel that, you know, I always have to force myself not consuming this product, and then you, oh yeah, I can actually soften that, so let's engage in the practice. Let's have this food I was craving for example, right? So that is one way, and the other way is, oh yeah, I was always looking to resist this hunger or this lust, right? And then you make use of the practice to do that. And I would argue that this is very much the same, very similarly to, you know, not only meditation, yoga, but also many types of these spiritual practices that that are currently discussed. Now, luckily, there's, of course, a bigger conversation, a bigger discourse on, you know, inner worlds and sustainability. So it's not limited to certain practices. And again, I do very much appreciate that. Yeah, so the idea of we as individuals have to play a role, and, you know, many things within us influence that. And it's not very clear which practice actually works how. Right? Or if there's actually practice, or what exactly we need to engage more deeply into this inner world, inner transformation aspect. And also this stronger interest in educational settings, like what would be inner learning outcomes, so to say. Also an interesting question, right? And I very much appreciate that. But also there, I recently become, as I mentioned at the beginning, somewhat skeptical. And the main reason is, perhaps, let me explain, you know, the rationale behind it. Probably it's quite clear, but, you know, from a sustainability science perspective, the idea would actually, you know, the question, how can we actually change the system, right? How can we become more sustainable, a more sustainable society? And there's a theory of leverage points. I don't know, is anybody familiar with this? Yeah. Okay, so the idea of leverage points would actually be, what's the most effective lever we can take to initiate systems change? So very simply speaking. And now what is underlying this idea of inner transformation is that, you know, we have a lot of more practical and technological tools, right? I don't know, let's say we need technologies to reduce CO2 emissions, right? Very simply speaking. And then you have more political levers. For example, I actually don't know how you call it in English, like CO2 taxes, right? So this idea of and CO2 trading, blah blah blah. So that's more of a political level, and of course tax systems and laws. But so the argument would be that the deepest leverage point would be to work on our mental models and mindsets. So that's the idea. And if we could, you know, change these mindsets, it's a very mechanistic depiction, by the way, right? Then we have a deeper leverage point to change the systems, and that is what is depicted here in this figure, is that this kind of, first of all, leads to societal transformation, then also an environmental, ecological transformation. So, something that I find, is anybody familiar with the inner development goals? Again, okay, somewhat. So, inner development goals, a recent trend that kind of, you know, tries to highlight the importance of inner qualities that we need, you know, to realize this inner transformation that comes along with this inner transformation. Also been, again, so, you know, I'm very much supportive also of these trends. I've been on the scientific advisory board for their inner development goals also, but I do think, and I do come to this idea more recently, that it is also a very, very instrumental perspective on, you know, changing the current state of affairs. In the sense of, also it is underlined, like follows exactly this idea of a very instrumental and positivist research paradigm that Habermas already has described. So the idea is that we can develop a clear understanding of reality. So that is first very positivist scene. Also a very clear understanding of what it needs to do that, right? And then we develop these like intervention methods to change it, again, very mechanistically speaking. So it's an idea of steering, an idea of control, and the idea of, intentional steering of reality. And, interestingly, there's a lot of stuff going on that really brings us to this instrumental idea. Oh, if you do that, then, all of a sudden we reach this new reality. And it really comes back to this idea that, psychedelics are more and more relevant for this purpose. Like, for example, we all could take some mushrooms right now, and then, surprisingly, we will become the new sustainability ambassadors through the inner transformation, right? And the same goes for, you could also join the IDG ambassador program, 3 days to go through your inner transformation. I'm wondering whether the new studies will focus on indigenous spiritual practices such as voodoo, right, or Torah cards. I don't know. Would be interesting, I find. And to some extent, this really reproduces this idea and the very, very problem that I would see, how we currently approach unsustainability, namely that the idea of quick fixes, right? So, oh yeah, that's the problem. I know how to solve it, and that's kind of exactly, what happens. You use the IDG, inner development measurement. You know that your inner development stays at 58%. Once you reached 100%, you're done, right? Based on 60 questions or so. But if you're just 58, then also you have this new transition maker toolbox. We exactly know which practice you have to do once to improve your inner development. I mean, really? Is that spiritual development? Well, anyway, also from an educational perspective, that is very much instrumental. This idea that we know our values, we know what we have to do, that is how it works, and this leads to behavioral outcomes that we do. That is also what my colleague Ian Walz, has often described as instrumental education. And I actually do think that this sort of instrumental education, it has its place. I do think it has its place, but at least from a spiritual perspective and also from a philosophy of science perspective, I think it is very much limiting our possibility to think about what sustainability actually is and how we can achieve it. And I want to give you 3 reasons for that. So the first reason, very much associated with my personal teaching experiences. So I developed something which I call reflexive knowledge generation. And I did this initially, like when starting my PhD, with this idea of, once you, meat consumption stuff, and I thought, okay, if you engage in your feelings, so not in the arguments, then you would feel this compassion, and that would automatically lead you to consume less animal-based foods, because my idea was that otherwise you would interpret information, based on on the emotional incongruence that you had, so kind of resolve the cognitive dissonance. But what actually happened, so I did this for many years, since 2016, what actually happened that my own behavioral, my own diet changed. That I got much more open to arguments that would actually speak in favor of consuming animal-based foods. And I've been a very convinced vegan for many years. And I found this remarkable because what I actually found that I had no idea about this complex evidence that was behind it. I had no understanding of it, really. And the same goes, if you ask me about, the arguments for climate change, I have no idea. I believe people who do it, but I personally, I don't get it at all. And I know that there are people who in many ways do think differently about how to deal with climate change. Right? So there are very much, so many opinions. And kind of what happened for me was this importance of becoming open and modest, epistemically modest, to what reality is and how we have to face it, right? And there are people who know much more about specific topics than I do, and who do much better in engaging with these people, instead of having my predefined ideas of what sustainability is. Now, the second part is that I would actually question, not from a deontological perspective, but from a virtue ethics perspective, perhaps, that we should engage with sustainability as a big change. Not from a deontological perspective, but very much to what we've heard yesterday. You know, the idea is you have to find peace within you to bring peace to the planet. And I think in the same way that, you know, for me, often this idea of you know, fighting for sustainability is based on this: we are infected by a virus, and then we try to heal everybody from this virus, but actually by being infected ourselves, we continually reinfect others with this virus, right? And well, I shared this picture that especially when my daughter was born, you know, I really felt this importance of, if I really want to treat my daughter the way that my values oblige me to do, it requires so much effort to work on myself, you know, to be that father, like to remain patient in difficult situations and so on and so forth. And it is so difficult to do that to one person, you know, to really be, you know, live the qualities of life that you want to have in this world to one person, that I think it's so, I don't know, who I am to know, you know, what the world needs. Like this modesty in thinking, you know, let's start with one individual, even ourselves, and live these qualities, and learn from that, and prove that we're actually able to solve bigger problems that we have in the world. And then there's a third part, and that is something that more recently came up to me, and I find interesting, is that to some extent I find that the whole sustainability narrative becomes a tranquilizer to more fundamental existential challenges that we might face, right? Like, for example, death, finiteness, uncertainty, you know? And all these things, pain, suffering, that are like an inextricable part of human existence. And I to some extent, I find it important to make sure that, you know, we should make sure, we should be careful that the narrative of sustainability does not become this tranquilizer to actually ignore these facts, right? Perhaps from an existential perspective, it makes sense to, in the first place, face the possibility that a sustainability transformation will fail, because there are actually indicators that it will. How do we deal with it? And I think if we are not able to face that reality, we might spiritually not be ready to deal with sustainability in the first place. Now, you know, let me come to an end with a few slides in terms of, you know, how do I translate that in my own educational and research practice. And the very first is, you know, this shift from an instrumental to an emancipatory research and educational paradigm. And that means a paradigm from, you know, not understanding to change, but understanding to explore, to know, you know, I don't know what comes next, but I know that there's something that I can inquire into, and that there's a reality to face, but I don't know what this reality is yet, and what it serves me or leads me to. And in this sense, I would actually consider research very much as a spiritual practice in itself. Not research in the way we have heard about it yesterday, but what I call personal sustainability science. And that is what I define as a systematic inquiry of the subjective experience of inner states and processes occurring in relation to sustainability. And there's no immanent understanding what sustainability is here, right? But I do explore in my own inner states and processes based on thick phenomenological research methods. So it's really a self-inquiry, right? And the idea behind it would be if I explore into myself in these inner states and processes, there's also this normative idea, not, we go there, but to create something which I call responsibility. So there's an ability to self-determinedly respond to what is happening within me. I do particularly apply that and integrate it in my teaching in a way that I let students inquire into questions they personally bring. Right? So the student comes with a question and uses, and usually it's associated with a transformative project, so I'll give you an example for that in a second. And what the person actually does is exploring him or herself in this process. So the emotions that come about, all these inner stuff that is going on. So it's a kind of a course design. You can also currently working on it as a program design, curriculum design. But anyway, so it really consists of, there's a very hands-on activity, a hands-on practice that you pursue. You document this practice, so there's a kind of data collection associated with it. And there's a kind of introspective practice associated with this. So to deepen the own experience of what is going on. And of course, there's a lot of peer exchange. And what I mean by subjective experience, I really mean, what constitutes human being. To be a human, everything, the body, the senses, the feelings, everything that we are. And then, of course, there are several ways of, translating that into performance indicators if you need them, right? For example, of individual reflections on what is going on. What I also find important is this analysis in groups that, so it doesn't remain just personally, but also there's an exchange to see, how do other people experience the same thing, right? One example that I want to share was, a course that I've repeatedly done, where students choose a change project where they say, okay, that would be a change in my life that I find inspirable, that would add quality of life to my existence at this very moment. So we're starting with something specific, relevant to them. And then they basically ask this question of what are the challenges that I face by trying to do that, and what would be the qualities that I need to overcome these challenges. And what I mentioned before is that they engage in several practices, for example, also these more contemplative practices, but also a lot of phenomenological interviewing, microphenomenological self-inquiry. Probably you're not familiar with these methods, but yeah. Anyway, practices that supports the students to deepen their experience and really inquiring into their experience. And from there, of course, there are different ways. What I used here is that they engage in this analysis of what is actually happening beyond, the spontaneous sense making, but they do that in a systematic way. And in this sense, we can of course talk about the competence term, but I do like it in this sense because it's not something that I objectively define. Like what is the purpose of this whole learning for them? But for me, it's also the idea of defining the learning outcome of these processes again from a first personal perspective. So it's not based on this instrumental paradigm, but more one that links back to the subjective experience of a person, and namely the ability, what I mentioned before, to respond to inner states and processes in a conscious and self-determined way, right? So, for example, if I, at this point before, if I get confronted with the possibility that current approaches to face climate change will fail, and then I notice that I get afraid of it, and then I start immediately trying to find this anchor that helps me to solve this unpleasant state of anxiety, that is very much an automatic response that I haven't chosen. And so the idea would be, I can still do that, but for me the idea would be, am I actually able to stay with that feeling to maintain that feeling, and based on that, make the decision of what do I think is the right way now, not automatically, behaving. And I mean, I think all of us know a lot of daily situations in which we haven't yet cultivated responsibility. Now, I come back to this idea of truth as the inner compass. I don't know what truth is. Right? I have no idea what truth is. But I do know that there is a truth that I can pursue. I do very much know when I'm not honest to what I see. I do very much know that. And I do very much know if there's something else further to inquire. And that is the inner compass that I mean. I clearly know that there's something going on that I can deepen, but I will never reach it. I think I will never reach it, and that is part of the challenge of being human. There's also, the more philosophical existential perspective from Jean-Paul Sartre says, we are obliged to be free. Man is obliged to be free. And that is part of it, that, that creates the freedom that we just don't know where to go, because otherwise it wouldn't be free. But, again, there's this knowing, okay, yeah, there's something that I can pursue. And that is what I would call like a deep spiritual practice, seeking that, following this compass. And what I do think that we need a kind of inner freedom to do that. And that's where I see the role of inner development also in the context of sustainability. That it is.